Now apparently the Bulldogs managed to beat the draft. Now I have no idea what that even means. So I'm going to go and explore and find out. If you enjoy the video or if you learned something new, remember, like, subscribe. Let's go. So this video I think is for you Bulldog fans, alright? So I hope you appreciate it.
In the rotation of the AFL and many sports, there are multiple ways to acquire players to build a winning team. Typically, you can go secure them through free agency signings and trades with other teams, but the biggest risk, highest reward method is through the draft. The AFL draft involves picking 18-year-old kids fresh out of high school from the local representative teams and bringing them to your team in the hope that they will become stars of the league in a few years' time.
Now I did a draft video from the same guys, and one of the main points I made was, is it always a levelling system, as in levelling out the teams in the league? Because, and what this is alluding to is it's a real gamble. You know, you are hoping that you pick up some 18-year-olds. I know it's not all just 18-year-olds, but that is the gist of it. That is the mainly 18-year-olds. Now, it's a risk, but as they say, it's a high risk, high reward. You are choosing 18-year-olds that could be complete flops. However, they could be absolute world beaters. And when I say world beaters, Australia beaters, because it's only in Australia mainly. So yeah, at least it's going on the same point as I actually made. So sometimes I do say the right things, sometimes.
Unlike the American leagues, it was only recently that teams have started to spend a lot of money scouting the junior leagues looking for the right talent. In previous decades, it was very common to see number 1 picks hardly playing a season and 50th picks tearing the league apart. But despite all the developments in scouting, picking which kids are going to turn into 300 gamers and which are going to fizzle out in the limelight is a lot of guesswork. Which is why when teams get it right, it's so impressive.
And the interesting thing is that when they're 18, yes, it's all well and good doing this fitness test and the combine or whatever you want to call it, but they're still growing. Even at the age of 18, these young lads are still growing, they're still developing. Their potential could be there, but they may not fill it. And that young player could be number 1 draft pick because everyone thinks he's going to be great, and he doesn't. It just doesn't fulfill his potential. And we see this all the time in soccer, in football, because the amount of times players are seen as the next so-and-so player, but actually end up complete flops.
And there's one team that does it as good, possibly if not better, than anyone else. The fairy tale premiership of the Western Bulldogs from 2016 has had plenty of commentary around its incredible nature and circumstances. Coming from 7th with a young team and coach, breaking a 62-year premiership drought. But one of the more interesting things about the 2016 flag is how they built the team that won it all. And surprisingly, it's nearly all from the draft. 19 of the 22 2016 premiership players had been Bulldogs the entire time they were in the league. For context, during Hawthorn's three-peat, they averaged only 15 of their 22 being drafted at Hawthorn, and the rest taken from other clubs. And Richmond and West Coast both had 16 of 22 premiership players acquired through the draft for their flags in recent years. For the Dogs to get just 3 premiership players from other clubs in 16 is a strange occurrence.
And remember, coming from a football soccer side of things, it is alien to me, and I've admitted this, and I've tried being open, and I don't necessarily like the idea of a draft. However, I can appreciate it. I can understand why some of people do, but it's alien to me to think, because over here, you buy players from other clubs to bring to your club to be successful. So that's just what I'm used to.
So, how did they do it? Although a largely young team, building this list started all the way back in the early 2000s. In 2001, the Pups drafted the guy that would go on to play the most ever games from a player from the rookie draft. Matthew Boyd was a touch machine for the Dogs in his early and later years, averaging 27 possessions in the flag year, at pick 22 in the rookie draft. The Dogs were still relevant, but transitioning from aging stars like Tony Liberatore and Scott Wind into a younger core. Boyd went on to make 2 All-Australian teams. In 2004, the Dogs got 100 scored on them 18 out of 22 rounds.
God,
so when they went to the draft, they were looking for defenders late in the order to reduce the scoring barrages that they were frequently on the wrong end of. And the most successful came out of Werribee at number 19 in the rookie draft again, where they snagged a young buck, Dale Morris. Moz went on to play 253 games at the club, including an All-Australian appearance. And a common trend has already arisen and will continue to be seen, with a lot of these players coming off the rookie draft. The rookie list, for those unaware, allows for clubs...
I really love the idea of the child gives the medal and the player gives the child the hat. It's such a lovely, lovely idea.
...clubs to keep extra players outside of their limited 38-man squads. These rookies can't play until they're elevated to the senior list, but can train and demonstrate their abilities. The Bulldogs recruiters not only had a knack for spotting talent, but also untapped potential that was then able to be nursed at the club into realisation. Now is as good a time as ever to start crediting the recruitment managers behind these eventual genius draft picks. Back in this portion of the Dogs' history, most of the kudos needs to go to Scott Clayton, who worked as Footscray's chief talent spotter upon leaving Brisbane in 1998, after virtually building the entire Lions three-peat team. He spotted Boyd and Morris at low picks, knowing he didn't need to take them high, and elevated them quickly to the senior lists.
That's clever. It's clever. It's seeing the potential. It's seeing the potential in a player that maybe the others don't see. And teams over in England, for example, have been good at that. For example, as a Southampton fan, we've had so many players that we've brought in that Southampton's known as a selling club because well, not recently, but we managed to find really good players that others haven't necessarily had their eye on. We then bring them to the limelight and sell them for more money. Frustrating as a Saints fan because we would like to keep them. But yeah, it's about seeing the potential in players that others don't see, and then you get a bit of a steal.
Fast forward through to 2007, where a young man was running out his high school years on a cricket scholarship at Geelong Grammar. Easton Wood did not play junior representative footy, which is the usual way to get spotted. Instead, Scott Clayton saw Easton get a run for Geelong Grammar in a school footy game and told him to declare for the draft. A smoky heading in, the Dogs took him at pick 43 in the national draft, with Clayton seeing something in his leaping ability.
I bet this lad, he's declared himself for the draft. Number 43. How many players in the draft are sitting there thinking, oh, please be me next, please be me next. And each number goes past, each number, imagine being the guy that got picked 50th. I think it goes up to 50. Correct me if I'm wrong, but imagine being the last pick and you're sitting there all night thinking, please pick me, please pick me, please pick me. Yeah, imagine if, for example, that the team told you, said they're going to pick you, and they never actually do. You'd be gutted. I don't know if that happens.
The following year, in 2008, the Dogs began their first of 3 preliminary final runs. In this time, their draft picks were being used on players they believed would strengthen their depth and possibly shore them up for a lengthy period of success, although were unlikely to crack the side at the time. Coinciding with this new attitude of future-proofing was the hiring of Simon Dalrymple as a development coach who would eventually transition into their head role of national recruiting manager. With him and Scott Clayton at the helm, they drafted tall, and among others, at pick 31, Jordan Roughead was a response to the lack of height the Dogs list was crippled by against big marking teams. The Roughead name made famous already at Hawthorn by Jordan's cousin Jared. The Dogs were impressed by Jordan's slick agility for a guy of his size. It is, however, important to note here that the Dogs didn't always get it right. They used their earlier pick in that year, number 14, maintaining systemic height across the entire 08 draft class, to take Ace Cordy. At 204 centimetres, they assumed he could fix their ruck problems for the foreseeable future. But he didn't eventuate where Jordan Roughead did 15 picks later.
A quick point on that, it's a lot of stop-start in this video, but I hope you enjoyed the feedback, the reaction, the relation to what I know in soccer. Now, this is always a problem. There's always going to be flops. If you look at, say, Sir Alex Ferguson at Manchester United when he was the manager, now, he brought in so many good young players and experienced players. However, there is a litter of poor players that just never made it, were never good enough, never became good enough. So even the best teams who are at the best at picking players to become good, and have the high potential, even then there are still flops. And this is my point, that not all players fulfill their potential. So even the teams like the Bulldogs here can still get some flops.
As much as the Bulldogs' talent scouts were proficient, some players excelled in the Dog system and others didn't, as with most clubs. But we'll speak more on that later. That same year they took at pick 30 on the rookie draft the man who would become the most valuable player of the 2016 finals. Another rookie list success. However, Liam Picken was promoted to the senior list almost immediately, building off his Williamstown form, excelling as a much needed tagger. After a flat draft year in 2009 with limited selections after a very good season, in 2010 they saw an absolute no-brainer, as Brownlow medalist and club champion Tony Liberatore's son Tom was on the draft board. With the dodgy father-son rule allowing Premier players to drop low, Tom was reserved by the Dogs at pick 41 and debuted round 1 2011. Tom was drafted as a physical inside mid, winning an eventual best and fairest in 2014. The dawn of the new decade was where the Dogs' premiership team really started to emerge without them even realising.
We're slowly realising this is a case of the Bulldogs playing a long game. When it keeps going back to the dates, it's moving. That's about 10 years almost. 10 years and slowly building it up. I assume they had pretty much a rebuild of their squad, and it doesn't happen over time. So they've been patient and they bring in youth players in so they can develop, become experienced. Then more youth players come in to bring the youth, and then they get experience as well. It's playing the long game.
2011 was a compromised draft because GWS were handed nearly the entire top prospect list by the AFL as they were incepted. But at pick 17, the Bulldogs took an on-field enforcer, Clay Smith, set to become a cult figure in the western suburbs. Head recruiter suggested that Clay had the toughness to replace the hole that was left by departing Callan Ward. Injuries hampered Smith throughout his career, but when his body was right, he was sharper than most, and reaped the ultimate reward 5 years into his career, after 3 knee reconstructions. At pick 57, the Dogs hunted for someone who could turn opportunities into goals, as the likes of Barry Hall and Jason Ackermanis were on their way out. Mature age recruit Tory Dixon was their answer, and a fine one he was, returning 50-goal seasons before ultimately snagging premiership success.
Every team, no matter what sport, no, it depends what sport, because some sports don't score goals, but the sports that score goals, you need a goal scorer. You don't win games if you don't have a goal scorer. Simple as. So every team needs a really good one.
Rookie draft that year, the Dogs used pick 22 on yet another success story, Luke Dalhouse, soon to become the face of the club's membership campaigns with his dreadlocks and gritty small forward play. Flourishing in the system, Dalhouse ended up in the 40-man All-Australian squad multiple times and stands as one of the Dogs' biggest rookie draft insights. Pick 39 in the rookie draft exemplified the Bulldogs' prowess when it came to talent scouting. Jason Johannesson didn't pick up the game of AFL until he was a teenager, as he spent the first 8 years of his life in South Africa. His speed around the footy was spotted by now head recruiter Simon Dalrymple, and he was picked up. Dalrymple noted that JJ was effectively taken 140th overall, which is one of the larger returns on such a low pick of all time, as he would develop eventually into a Norm Smith medalist. Dalrymple said, Jason was a boy who only averaged 10 to 12 possessions for East Fremantle Colts and only played half a year of Colts footy, so he's come a long way.
Potential, finding the potential and finding the players that the other teams don't realise have the potential.
The pre-season draft, which occurs prior to the start of the AFL season as opposed to the end of the last season, saw the Dogs snag an unlikely premiership hero, Fletcher Roberts. Lanky but mobile, the Dogs wanted an inside tall, but quickly adapted Fletch into a key defender, with some tall tasks over the course of his career. Recruiters at the Dogs, including Dalrymple and list manager Jason McCartney, waited to get Roberts as they knew he would take a while to develop due to a lack of conditioning. It was this foresight that allowed the recruiting team to predict players' positioning and potential ahead of time, and an instinct that the Bulldogs were blessed to have. This era also saw the Dogs drop on-field form, missing multiple final series, and as a result, accruing some higher draft picks. The following year's draft was even more successful than the last. At their earliest pick, they selected the man who would become the biggest public personality in the team, and was selected for his ability to be a highlight reel, bringing not only goal-scoring forward craft, but also putting people in seats. Jake Stringer lived up to all that at pick number 5, and despite his divisive personality and the fact that he was only 21 despite looking 42 when they won the flag, the package lived up to all of it, snagging an All-Australian in 2015.
That's an interesting point they make, actually, because it does seem that sports need those characters that not necessarily the best player, but is a character that draws fans in to actually want to watch them. It's an interesting point because you need the money, you need the finances, and sometimes a player like that can do that, whether or not they're the best player or not. It's an interesting point to make, actually.
The national recruiters did a lot of homework on Stringer, suggesting that his power and football smarts were years ahead of his true age. Back-to-back picks spelled back-to-back success because Jackson Macrae was taken at pick 6 and has developed into an All-Australian regular, nearly always topping the most disposals list. Macrae was a key element of the 16 side, but developed into an absolute superstar since. They snagged Lachie Hunter at pick 41 under father-son. These Bulldog father-son picks were pretty obvious and nearly all of them paid off. Lachie turned into a quintessential winger, with a sharp left boot, filling an incidental hole in the playing list despite being a guaranteed father-son selection, and winning a best and fairest in the process.
That seems to certainly help if you've got the father-son rule. That you can pick a player that is likely to be pretty good. Normally, if the dad is good, the son should be okay. So if you can get them at a lower pick, use up less points and all that, if I remember rightly about the draft, that can only be a good thing.
2013 typified the Bulldogs' poor form and saw them pull the highest in the draft they had to date, pick number 4. And they spent that pick on the piece de resistance of the eventual premiership. A little Italian boy named Marcus Bontempelli, eventual All-Australian, consistently near the top of the Brownlow votes and dual best and fairest including in a premiership year, a novelty feat only accomplished by the great E.J. Whitten, who Bont has drawn numerous comparisons with. Simon Dalrymple said after the 2013 draft that they did a lot of character research into Bontempelli prior to drafting him, talking in depth with his school and friends, and made the assessment that a full-time system would allow him to realise his potential. Because most draft boards had Bont going much lower than pick 4, but in the conversation as the best in the game right now means they certainly wouldn't regret a thing. 2014 was an interesting year. Departures of captain Ryan Griffin, Adam Cooney and Sean Higgins, as well as pick 6 in the draft they had earned from a measly 14th place finish in a trade for Tom Boyd. The club was going through what President Peter Gordon described as a crisis. They seemed to largely lack direction.
So this sort of goes against what I was saying. So obviously you would assume that if it's a rebuild, you would start off poorly and then you would slowly get better and better and better as you get the picks in, players get more experienced. But this seems a bit of an anomaly that actually they were building their team and all of a sudden they had a really off season. Seems strange.
And this meant that despite poor results, the Dogs were unable to rely on high picks for personnel. Despite this, the recruiting team still had ideas about the team they wanted to construct, and at number 26 they scouted Toby McLean for his inside play and head over the footy mentality that fit perfectly into the system of players they were going for. McLean became proficient in the string handball game that made the Dogs successful, and all the way down at pick 46 they acquired who Matthew Lloyd now believes is possibly the greatest either foot kick the game has ever seen. Caleb Daniel was overlooked by nearly the entire draft board, presumably due to his height. But his target hitting efficiency and decision making meant he finished second in the Rising Star and made his first All-Australian team this year. Lower again at pick 62, the Dogs picked up Zane Cordy as another key defender to try and take away a big body. A shot in the dark, Cordy was another example of a low pick that blossomed into a regular and ended up kicking the first Bulldog goal on that fateful day in October.
His name will live on in memory then.
The final piece of the draft puzzle came in 2015, just a year before the flag, when at pick 25, the Dogs snagged Josh Dunkley, a tall midfielder who played a number of games in his first season, which ended up being a premiership start. Although Dunks wasn't the most impactful player at the time, post-2016 he got the All-Australian squad nod and has developed into an absolute midfield star. Amazingly, only 3 of these 19 players were taken in the top 10 of any draft, with a whopping 6 players coming out of the rookie draft, a draft that has an incredibly low rate of converting into stars. But 4 of these players ended up making All-Australian squads. If you look through the drafts, you'll note that the Bulldogs, as previously mentioned, didn't always get it right, and for every successful draft pick, there is a bust to go with them. But the undeniable amount of success stories allow for the right amount of speculation that the Bulldogs have impeccable ability to spot talent from a mile away. President Peter Gordon attests to the idea that Scott Clayton, Simon Dalrymple and their teams put in the absolute hard yards to assess character and skills of potential draftees, monitoring players constantly at junior levels. Interestingly, the Bulldogs have actually been very poor at signing and trading big name players, with a few famous exceptions. But their attention to detail when it comes to drafting is historically impressive, and their trend appears to continue. Another aspect of these draft success stories is the prospect that they clearly fit into the Bulldogs system extremely well, which begs the question whether the system accelerates development in young players, or whether these are just the players that slipped in best out of the many picks they had over the years, and hence rose to the top. The Bulldogs often put in frequent games into their draft picks no matter how low they were taken, and this early exposure could be a reliable method of realising potential, as could the generally praised culture in the playing group of the Western Bulldogs, particularly during this decade, even through their challenging times on field. This blueprint can be adopted by a lot of teams in the league, as the majority of these picks occurred over the course of just 5 years, and it's undeniable that going to the draft can and will build you a premiership team, a fact that the Dogs were very happy to discover. The series of drafts were the keys to give the Bulldogs the tools to break a 62-year drought in fairy tale fashion.
That's a long time.
And the nature of which it came about is a story for another day.
Now, as I said, it seems the draft, and this is the same as I said in most sports, some of the best teams are able to find players with potential that other teams don't see. That's how you get them cheaper, or in this case, at a lower draft position. But there's always going to be flops, because once again, it is potential. Potential isn't ability. You know, those two aren't the same. And you've got to realise that. But all clubs that are good at finding the potential in players also find plenty of flops. As I said, the example of Sir Alex Ferguson at Manchester United, he got plenty of flops. However, he got plenty that were world beaters. So it's interesting, and it's interesting because it's playing the long game. That was a long time from starting that project to actually finishing it. And you have to, if you're relying on a draft system especially, and you're not just in soccer, getting a billionaire giving you loads of money, you can completely replace the squad in a season or two. You can't do that. You have to do it over years rather than a couple of years. So it's really interesting, and it shows that you can do it as long as the scouting is spot on. And it's not just looking at the ability, potential, it's also looking at their mentality and their behaviour and their character. There's so much that goes into it. So fair play to the Bulldogs. They've clearly got a good system of bringing in these youngsters. So that's good to see. Anyway, I'll leave you there. If you enjoyed the video, like and subscribe. I will catch you next time.